Well, compared to the rates in the 80s and early 90s, crime overall is down in this country, but rampage shooters are increasingly common, and they're killing more people, obviously. Almost all of them are young men. The question, which for some reason very few people ask, but is the key question, is what's driving this surge in extreme antisocial violence? One man who's been thinking about it a lot is Jordan Peterson. He's a psychology professor at the University of Toronto, and he just spoke with us moments ago. Here it is. Jordan Peterson, thanks for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
We wanted to ask you the question that we think too few are asking, which is, why is this happening? Why are young men shooting up schools?
Because they're nihilistic and desperate.
How'd they get that way?
Well, I think life can make you that way unless you have a purpose and a destiny, let's say. I mean, there's no shortage of suffering and malevolence in life, and it's easy for people to become embittered by that. And if they don't see a way out, see a way forward, they get angry about it and turn against life itself. And they make a display of their hatred for being by massacring the innocent. That's what's happening. And they write that.
They do write that. It's accelerating.
Yes.
The reserve of guns has, I mean, we've had semi-automatic rifles for 100 years, but we haven't had this number of school shootings. So the attitudes are changing, I think it's fair to say.
Well, it's also kind of a psychological epidemic. You know, these people keep track of each other, and there's a competitive element to it. And the fact that the media insists upon publicizing the names of these shooters is not helpful, because part of what drives them is motivation for notoriety, because notoriety is better than being ignored.
So what mistakes do you think we're making as a society to produce an ever-increasing number of young men like this?
That's a good question. I think we underestimate the necessity for young people to have clear direction and a sense of purpose in their life. They need something to offset the tragedy and malevolence of life. And we need to take these sorts of philosophical and even religious issues seriously, but we don't.
Do you think we're taking them less seriously than we used to?
Yes, definitely. I think that we talked in the past, we spoke much more about responsibility and responsibility in particular, but also purpose and maturity, and we valued those things highly. We didn't confuse them with tyranny and toxic masculinity, for example.
Speaking of toxic masculinity, why is it all boys?
Well, boys are more aggressive than girls, and there's a biological component to that that's quite strong. That's why the vast majority of people in prison are male. Like, on average, there's not much difference in aggression between men and women. If you picked a random woman and a random man out of the population and you had to bet on who was the most aggressive, if you bet it was the woman, you'd be right 40% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, and those would be the people in prison, they're all men, or virtually all men. It's also why males attempt suicide less frequently, but they commit it successfully much more frequently. They're much more likely to use lethal means. And there's a very powerful biological component to that, despite what the postmodern social constructionists have to say about it. But they've got their head firmly buried in the sand, so.
Yeah, no, they're resistant to the evidence and reality. We know that. So, but given that we know that boys are the ones, if there is a school shooting, who are going to be the ones committing it overwhelmingly, shouldn't we be thinking about how to raise our boys in a way that they're less likely to do this?
Yeah, I think we should be thinking about that. I mean, the book I published here, this 12 Rules for Life, is a meditation on exactly that. I've been lecturing online about the idea that responsibility is what gives life meaning, and that meaning is the antidote to the sort of nihilism and aggression and resentment that can otherwise be produced. I mean, there's no doubt that life is difficult and that people get hurt and betrayed. That's unassailable truth. You need something to offset that, and most people find that in their destiny, in their adoption of responsibility, and their willingness to make their own lives better and the lives of their families better, and to contribute to the community and to bear the burden of being nobly. And that works, but we don't think that way anymore.
You mentioned the toxic masculinity. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I've heard the phrase a lot. What does it mean in our public conversation when someone attributes the shooting to toxic masculinity?
Well, it's an attempt to smear the idea of masculinity by confusing masculine competence with tyranny. And it's part of the underlying idea that our culture is a corrupt, tyrannical patriarchy that was run by men for the advantage of men, which is a very pathological way of looking at the world, but a very common one. And if that description is accepted, then it means that masculine energy, so to speak, whether it's manifested by women or by men, that masculine energy does nothing but prop up the tyranny of the patriarchy, and so should not be fostered. And the only people who think that way are women whose relationships with men have been extraordinarily damaged, or men who have no idea who they are, or who are trying to shirk responsibility. The idea that masculinity in its essence is somehow toxic is an absolutely dreadful idea.
I'm glad I asked you that question. Jordan Peterson, thank you.
Hi, this is Jeff Short, and welcome to another edition of Christian Answers. And I just got done watching a video by Canadian intellectual Jordan Peterson, and he was talking about what causes young men to shoot up schools. One of the very topics that I have been engaged in and talked about for the last couple weeks since the mass shooting. I've done some videos on this subject. I've done a couple videos with the Reverend Mel McGinnis. We sat down, discussed, and concluded this was a spiritual issue. And this is a spiritual issue that involves people, young people, who are basically essentially nihilists. And that is the philosophy that it doesn't matter. Things don't matter anymore. They've given up hope. They've given up faith. They don't care about things anymore. And they're willing to die and take other people with them. That's the philosophy of nihilism. A nihilist doesn't necessarily have to kill or injure other people, but it's a philosophy of despair. It's a philosophy that basically says there's nothing worth living for. Life is meaningless. Life is pointless. And we've talked about this over the last couple weeks. I've spent a couple programs here on Christian Answers, and then I think I dealt with this topic about 3 or 4 programs on my other television program, Christ and Culture, and had a discussion on this very topic. Why do especially young boys shoot up schools? And the only voice that I've heard that was basically saying what I was saying was I read an article by Pat Buchanan where he talked about nihilism.
Joining us now, Pat Buchanan, author, commentator, presidential advisor. I wrote a terrific piece, A Moment of Unity in a Disintegrating World. He joins us now. Pat, it's good to talk to you. The patter that we're hearing repeated, the same lines from mostly Democrats on the size of the magazine, the bump stock, he purchased 33 guns in a year, thoughts and prayers aren't enough, They're all reading from the same tedious playbook.
They do get back on the same hobby horse and start riding it again and again and again every time one of these incidents occurs. But I think there's really, in this, I haven't seen, Laura, any mailed agenda or statement of beliefs or, some aggressive note about what the national government did to him. I think what we got here is something that's fairly clear and fairly simple. This guy decided to end his life. He decided to commit suicide either by gunshot to his mouth or either by a police shooting him. And he planned to go out as the greatest mass murderer in American history. And he moved all those guns in over 5 days and plotted this all out and began shooting and killing people down there in order that he would exceed anyone else. For example, the thing that comes to mind is when I was fairly young, Charlie Whitman, 1966, I believe it was, went up in that tower, Texas Tower at Austin, and shot, I believe, 41 people and murdered 15. This is similar to that. It's just he wants to end his life in a blaze of what for him might be glory and what for the nation is incredible horror.
Well, I think that Republicans tend to themselves get into a defensive crouch when the Democrats jump on their moral high ground here and start lecturing on guns. And I think it's precisely at this time where Americans should realize that there's not a government solution for every problem, that there is evil in the world, real evil.
This is exactly right. This is what the interesting question to me here is, what kind of evil does it take? I mean, here's someone with a dead soul. His conscience is completely dead. I mean, I don't care how bad a number of people are, they would recoil at firing a semi-automatic or an automatic weapon into a crowd of concert goers, none of whom they can have a grudge against, probably none of whom they know, and just do that, the callous and total indifference to the value of human life, that suggests to me, something is dead inside. What was it Raskolnikov who said, if God is dead, everything is permissible? And this individual clearly believes that he's not going to suffer any more, other than that gunshot to his head that killed him, for what he has done, this horror he has perpetrated on living human beings. I'd really be more interested in the character of that man's soul and what it was like than whether he sent some agenda, that the federal government has abused me and I've had trouble with the IRS.
Well, I think that we live in a society where there's so much depravity. I mean, at every turn. I was in New York the last couple of days, and it's fun to go to New York. I mean, I had to be there for Fox, and I have a lot of great memories with my brothers there as a kid, and even when the difficult times of crime and so forth. It's always been fun. But walking across Times Square, now you run into women that have just Band-Aids on their breasts and are essentially wearing thongs, walking around with body paint, and children. There's just it's the level of sort of pornography, violent pornography, and run-of-the-mill just kind of gross stuff.
Right, it is
everywhere.
Whatever they say about the 1950s, which were a pretty good time, and wasn't a saintly decade. The complete de-Christianization of the culture and of the natural, the prohibitions in society and the restraints and the beliefs that people followed about modesty and decency and morality and things. That's gradually, it takes generations once the root is cut. But the root has been cut, and I think the situation is not going to get better and better. Indeed, must have been, now there are so many we can't count, of these mass murders where individuals just go in and shoot and kill as many people as they can, knowing full well that they're going to command unprecedented coverage. Look what we got out there. You got every commentator talking about it. We're talking about it a couple of days later.
Yeah.
You got all Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, all
there's no other
there.
story. There's no other story.
Well, exactly, and this guy is a nobody, and now he's
a somebody. That's why I reject covering this 24/7. I don't like it. It doesn't feel right to me.
This is why. See, this is the currency he wanted to be paid in, and he's being paid. This was a success for this guy because he's got. We got North Korea and Puerto Rico and everything all off page one, and you read more and more about him, and 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 the 100,000 he sent to the Philippines, and is there a note somewhere, and all this interest in him, and nobody gave a damn about that guy for his whole life, and now everybody in the world is talking and writing about him, which is his reward. He succeeded.
And it's perverse in that
It is,
the media
it's
culture,
to the society.
yeah, that the media culture, which back in 1996 when I started at MSNBC, I dubbed it tragedy TV, TTV, whether it was John Benet Ramsey or Chandra Levy or Natalie Holloway, these stories in a way are easier to cover.
Well, but they say something about society because the editors picking the placement and sending the reporters know what folks want to read.
Well, in the absence of anything else, they'll watch it.
And that's exactly what we're seeing here. We're seeing nihilism come to the forefront in our culture. And so what we're seeing is the philosophy of nihilism raising its ugly head. And so one of the things that intrigued me about the discussion that Jordan Peterson and Tucker Carlson had on Fox News was that Jordan Peterson, the first thing out of his mouth in explaining the Florida school shooting was that this young man was nihilistic, that he had given up hope. He was angry, he was bitter. And one of the things that he brought out that really hasn't been brought out very much in the media, hasn't been brought out very much in the world of intellectual academy, is that he is diagnosing this young man's problem, and he says that nihilism played a major part in that shooting, and that this young man did not have any of the traditional means by which to deal with the nihilism that he was experiencing. And he didn't talk a lot about the role of religion. He talked about the role of philosophy, and he did mention religion. But in the past 3 or 4 programs of my other program, Christ and Culture, myself and the Reverend Mel McGinnis talked about the nihilism caused by stripping away all Christian language and expression from the public square. And this is exactly what Jordan Peterson is saying, and this is exactly what Pat Buchanan was saying. And I don't know of any other people that are talking about this, but needs to be talked about, because this is going to happen more and more as we have a culture that was formed on the Judeo-Christian ethic, morality, religion. Culture was based on the Judeo-Christian ethic, but that ethic is being obliterated. It's being attacked from government, from the legal system, academia. Our colleges and universities are teaching pointlessness, meaninglessness, and whether they know it or not, they're teaching nihilism. And Jordan Peterson pointed out that in times past, you'd have these young men who were angry, frustrated, their life wasn't going the way they wanted it to go, and they would have the institutions of society that would support them in their dealing with problems. And one of the institutions was religion, the church, Christian faith, strong family, and you would have culture that would be reinforcing those institutions. You would have schools that would be reinforcing the Christian faith and reinforcing the traditional marriage structure, and you would have these institutions supported by the pop culture, and that would help in the case of the aggression of young men, anger that occurs from time to time because of life and they would have a way to deal with their problems in a constructive way. Well, you take away the Christian faith from the public square, you take away and undermine the church, you take away and destroy the definition of marriage and undermine family in that way from the government, and you're basically setting the young people in our society, especially the men or the young men, teenage guys, 20-something guys, you don't have any means by which to channel anger or to look at life from a different perspective. They're in their basements playing video games and watching violent movies. So you get what you see. And what's happening is we're seeing people lashing out in violence because they don't know any other way to vent their anger. They had Christianity stripped away from the public square. The churches are under assault by the government, a hostile secular government that wants to try to combat and destroy every Christian moral value and spiritual value. We saw that most recently in the battle for marriage. You know, Christianity teaches that a marriage is a man and a woman. That's what the Bible teaches. That's what our traditional Western society has adopted from Christianity and Judaism. And yet our government and the secular forces want to take and destroy that definition of marriage. And they want to teach that in the schools. They want to undermine Christian authority and Christian moral authority, Christian spirituality. In the schools, they want to teach that life is a product of an accident, that science explains life today as simply the coalescing of atoms and materialism and energy, and so you have no point or purpose to your life, it's just accident. And that's why these guys are nihilistic. And so when you undermine institutions like church, family, marriage, and all these other pillars of community, when you undermine them with secularism, then you get a secular state. You get a materialistic state. You get people acting on the basis of secularism. And what that shows up in young people is if they don't have a reason and a purpose for life, then they either distract themselves through entertainment or just spend as much time as they can having fun for as long as they can have fun, shirking responsibilities, not being accountable. There's no vision for life. There's no vision for the future. And they're believing everything they were taught in evolutionary biology classes. Well, then you have angry young men who shoot up schools, or angry older men like this Las Vegas shooter shooting up and killing 57 people that he didn't even know. Now, I think that's a very clear case of nihilism in Las Vegas. I was talking about this almost immediately after it occurred last fall, that this is a prime example of nihilistic philosophy taking place. They're not going to find a motive for this man's actions because his motive is buried deep within him, because it was a spiritual sickness. He didn't have a point or purpose for life. He didn't believe in God. He didn't believe in morality. And so his actions make sense from that perspective. Now, the school shooter, some people may want to say that he was a troubled youth. He had mental problems. He did have mental problems. But what was underneath all of those mental problems? If he had depression, what was underneath the depression? If he had anger, what was underneath the anger? Well, again, it goes into this culture of death, culture of nihilism, where if you take away meaning and purpose in a person's life, if the only thing he has are these little trivial projects that he carries out in life, and the school systems and the government and the secular pop culture, entertainment culture, live for the moment. They teach him to live for the moment. There's nothing beyond this life. You only have one life. Get whatever you want, take whatever you want, and you have no hope for the future. Well, then this makes perfect sense. Why not go in and shoot the school up? Why not go in and create mayhem and chaos? Why not do that? If there's no point or purpose to life, you're just doing something to gain an experience. And so it was interesting to hear Jordan Peterson talk on Tucker Carlson's program, because it's exactly right and it makes exact sense. And I don't understand why more people don't simply understand that this is the best explanation for why we're seeing what we're seeing. These young people have been raised on secularism, and they are beginning to act out their secularistic philosophy. The one they were taught by adults who didn't think that anything bad would happen as a result. But yeah, there are bad things happening, and we're going to see more of this as our culture descends into secular atheism. And there's only one way out of this downward spiral, and that is for a Christian, spiritual, and moral revival. And so we need to keep praying. We need to pray that that spiritual, Christian, and moral revival happens soon, or else we're headed for really dark days ahead in this nation. Well, I hope that's helped explain things for you, and we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.